I can't believe I'm saying this, but this is what happens when you look at your friend's girlfriend.
You ever been to a wedding where everything looks like a damn Pinterest board? Perfect lighting, string quartet, everyone pretending they're not sweating through their suits. But underneath it all, there's this weird, almost electric tension. Like, everyone's smiling, but someone's about to say something they shouldn't. That was this wedding. Picture perfect on the outside. But for Jake and Matt, there was something else bubbling under the surface. Not just nostalgia. Not just a little too much champagne. Something heavier. Jake and Matt went way back. Same neighborhood. Same schools. Same dumbass teenage years. They'd been through crushes, heartbreaks, terrible band phases, and maybe one regrettable tattoo between them. Life eventually tugged them in different directions, different cities, different careers, but every few years, the universe would throw them back together, just to see what would happen. This wedding, one of those moments. A friend from the old crew was getting married, and it felt like the kind of event where you'd catch up, swap stories, toast to the good old days, and call it a night. But yeah, that's not how it went down. Both showed up with their girlfriends, and from the outside, it looked like they were living the dream. Jake had Emily, this bright, talkative, ultra-social woman who seemed born to host dinner parties. She smiled at everyone, asked real questions, actually waited for the answers. Matt noticed. He didn't mean to. He really didn't. But it was hard not to. When he cracked a joke, Emily didn't just laugh. She lit up. When he talked about work, she looked interested, not like she was waiting for her turn to talk. And suddenly, Matt felt it. That weird ache. That thing you don't want to admit. The part of your brain that whispers, "Why doesn't Claire look at me like that anymore?" It wasn't that he didn't love her. He did. But in that moment, he started comparing. Emily seemed more tuned in, more present. Like the kind of person who notices when you change your cologne and remembers how you take your eggs. That kind of attentiveness, it hit hard. What Matt didn't know was Jake was having a whole parallel crisis on his end, because Claire, Matt's girl, was basically Emily's opposite. Quiet, poised, cool in that way, where you're not sure if she's into you or just politely tolerating your existence. But man, she had presence. When she spoke, it wasn't filler. She said stuff that made you stop and think. At one point, she dropped this low-key, brilliant take on the wedding speech, and it rattled Jake a little. In a good way. Emily, for all her sunshine, never really did that. She was sweet, yeah, but not deep. Not like that. And then, the mental gymnastics started. Jake found himself looking at Claire and wondering, why doesn't Emily challenge me like that? It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was that subtle sting of comparison. That little voice saying maybe you're missing out. So here you had two guys, childhood friends, each with a woman next to them, both secretly eyeing the others. Not with lust. Not yet. But with curiosity. With longing for something they thought they were supposed to have already. That's the thing about illusions. They don't need much to grow. Just a crack in the surface. Add a little alcohol, and you've got yourself a full-blown fantasy. As the night rolled on, so did the drinks. Speeches got sloppier. Music got louder. And Matt? He crossed that invisible line from tipsy to saying things he shouldn't. He leaned over to Jake, glass in hand, eyes heavy. "Hey man," he said, voice thick with booze and honesty. "Your girl's amazing. Seriously. She's just different. Like, she sees people." Jake froze. Just for a moment. One of those tiny hesitations most people would miss. But not Matt. And definitely not Jake himself. He forced a laugh, shrugged it off like it was no big deal. But in his mind, that comment was loud. Because Matt had just said what Jake was thinking. And suddenly, there it was. That weight. That thing between them. Not a fight. Not betrayal. But a shift. A moment you can't rewind. The kind of moment that starts small but changes everything if you let it. Most people? They don't even notice when this stuff begins. It's subtle. Quiet. Invisible if you're not looking for it. But it's there. And the mistake people make, the really big one, is thinking those thoughts don't matter if they stay in your head. Spoiler alert. They do. The next morning rolled in like a hangover with a grudge, slow, foggy, and full of things Jake didn't want to remember. He woke before Emily, sitting quietly at the edge of the bed while she slept, curled in the sheets, her breathing soft and steady. The half-full glass of water on the nightstand caught his eye, and for a while he just stared at it, letting the stillness wrap around him like a blanket he didn't quite deserve. He didn't want to wake her, not because she needed the rest, but because he needed the silence. It was the only thing keeping the night from catching fire in his mind. Matt's words from the reception kept echoing in his head, low and sharp, a thought he couldn't shake. The way he'd said it, the weight behind it. It wasn't just casual flattery. It carried something heavier, something Jake hadn't known how to name in the moment, but now couldn't ignore. There was a familiarity in Matt's tone, the kind of thing you only pick up when someone says something that's already been living in your own head. Elsewhere in the city, Matt was fighting through his own version of the aftermath. The headache and dry mouth were bad enough, but what really stung was the foggy regret. Too many drinks and too few boundaries. Claire was in the shower, the sound of water running behind a closed door, while Matt sat hunched over the tiny Airbnb table with his phone in hand, scrolling aimlessly through last night's photos. All smiles, all perfect poses, all pretend. The thing about pretending, though, it drains you, and it doesn't take long before the weight of it starts to show. He knew he'd overstepped. Maybe not in a way that would make the world implode, but enough to feel it. Enough to know the air between him and Jake had changed. And yet underneath the embarrassment, there was this stubborn truth. He'd meant every word. Emily really was different. And in a way he couldn't quite explain, it felt good to have said it out loud, even if it was the wrong time, the wrong place, and definitely the wrong person to say it to. Later that day, the two of them met up. No Emily, no Claire, no buffer, just them. They picked a small cafe tucked off a quiet street, someplace forgettable on purpose. It had low music, mismatched mugs, and an air of anonymity. Jake arrived first, sitting at a corner table nursing a coffee that tasted burnt and bitter. Matt showed up a few minutes late, hiding behind sunglasses that didn't match the weather, trying to act normal. They sat there with a quiet between them that felt heavier than the night before. It wasn't tension exactly, it was recognition. Something had shifted, and now they were both standing in the aftershock, unsure what to do with it. Eventually, the wall between them cracked. There was acknowledgement. Not an apology, not defensiveness. Just truth. A shared truth neither of them wanted, but both of them understood. Jake admitted that Claire had been on his mind. Her calm, her insight, the way she seemed to speak with purpose rather than noise. She had this gravity to her, the kind that made other people seem lighter by comparison, and Emily, warm and wonderful as she was, suddenly felt a little too easy. A little too predictable. Matt wasn't surprised. If anything, it made him feel less alone, less crazy. There was comfort in the fact that Jake had noticed too, even if that comfort came wrapped in guilt. But the thing about saying something out loud, even without the words, it changes the shape of it. It becomes real, permanent, and there's no taking it back. They sat for a little while longer, barely touching their drinks, staring past each other, both thinking about different women and the same question. When they finally parted, it was with quiet nods and half-hearted smiles, like they were trying to convince themselves that nothing had changed, but something had changed. Because what had started as a flicker of envy had turned into something heavier. And now, lodged deep in both of them, was a question neither could unask, no matter how hard they tried. Weeks passed, but the weight of that question didn't go away. It lingered, quiet, persistent, wedged in the corners of their minds like a splinter that wouldn't heal. Neither Jake nor Matt spoke of it again, but both carried it, dragging it behind them like a shadow that grew longer with every passing day. Jake, ever the optimist, decided to outrun it. He threw himself deeper into his relationship with Emily, as if more effort might drown the doubt. He planned a weekend away, just the two of them. A cozy cabin in the mountains, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. A reset. He told himself that what they needed was time alone, far from the wedding, far from Matt and Claire, far from that lingering, poisonous thought. And in some ways, it worked. Emily was everything she'd always been. Bright, affectionate, full of easy laughter and little surprises. She packed his favorite snacks without asking. She sang along to every song on the road trip, even the ones he skipped when he was alone. She brought along a goofy card game they used to play early in their relationship, the kind that made them laugh until their stomachs hurt. Jake smiled. He laughed. He kissed her forehead and held her hand. Everything looked right, but at night, when the world quieted and the fire flickered low, the noise inside his head came back. He found himself remembering a conversation from the wedding, Just a few minutes with Claire, but etched in his memory like a passage from a book you never meant to memorize. The way she spoke, thoughtful, deliberate, a quiet gravity in her voice. She didn't just talk, she made him think. And it wasn't what she said, but how she said it. How she listened, how she challenged him without trying. Emily was warm. She was comfort. But Claire made him feel seen. And the comparison, no matter how hard he tried to fight it, kept finding its way back into his mind. Matt, meanwhile, was unraveling in a different way. Where Jake tried to reconnect, Matt withdrew, slowly, quietly. Not enough to raise alarm bells, but enough that things began to shift. He stopped asking how Claire's day had been. He came home later than usual, vague about where he'd been. He started sleeping with his back turned to her, no longer reaching out in the middle of the night like he used to. Claire noticed. Of course she did. She wasn't the kind of woman who ignored silence, and the space between them had grown too wide to step over. One evening, while they sat across from each other over untouched Thai takeout, she finally asked the question that had been weighing on her chest for weeks. She asked him if he was still happy. Matt looked up, surprised. He said yes, too quickly. She didn't argue, she didn't cry. She simply nodded, her eyes fixed on him in that way that made it clear she didn't believe a word of it. In that moment, her calm, steady gaze stayed with him long after she'd gone to bed. He sat there alone at the table, the food cold, the lights dimmed, wondering how a love that had once felt so certain had started to drift without either of them realizing. Back in Jake's world, things began to splinter. The cabin trip had given them a moment of peace, but once they returned home, the rhythm of routine chipped away at the illusion. Everything started to feel muted. Jake began texting Matt more often, at first to distract himself, sending memes, jokes, half-hearted sports updates. But as the days went on, the conversations began to shift. They both danced around the topic at first, avoided saying anything too honest. But then, one night, late, quiet, after Emily had gone to bed, Jake sent the message that changed everything. He asked Matt if he ever wondered what might have happened if they'd ended up with each other's partners. Matt stared at the message longer than he meant to. The words hit harder than they should have, not because they were shocking, but because they were familiar. His reply came slowly, but truthfully. Yes, he said, more than I should. There's a moment, right before everything falls apart, when it still looks like everything's holding together. Smiles in public, casual affection, shared responsibilities. It all appears intact, but underneath, things are unraveling, thread by thread. And for Jake and Matt, the slide had already started. Slowly, subtly, but with purpose. What neither of them could admit aloud was that, somewhere deep down, they weren't sure they even wanted to stop it. After that text exchange, something in the air between them shifted. The idea of what if wasn't hypothetical anymore. It lingered in every conversation, every glance, every silence, a constant low-frequency hum just beneath the surface. Matt began seeing more of Emily. At first, it was coincidence. Group dinners, casual hangouts, weekend plans where the same familiar faces kept showing up. But soon, it wasn't random anymore. Lunches, coffee breaks, short chats that lasted longer than they should have. Emily laughed at his jokes in a way that felt sincere. She asked questions, remembered the answers. They bonded over small things, music, old movies, strange childhood quirks, things Jake had stopped noticing. Or maybe had never noticed at all. Meanwhile, Jake found himself drifting toward Claire in the way people drift toward firelight on a cold night. It started with small things, watching her Instagram stories a little too closely, rereading her captions, noticing her words more than her photos. She had a way of expressing herself that felt raw and polished all at once. He started replying here and there, thoughtful reactions, not flirtatious, but never entirely innocent. And she responded, just enough to keep the door cracked open. Then came the dinner. Claire suggested it. A double date. Easy, low stakes. A cozy Italian place downtown with warm lighting and good wine. The kind of night that, in theory, should reinforce connection. But Matt hesitated. Not because he didn't want to spend time with the group, but because he wasn't sure he trusted himself anymore. Still, he went. And for a while, everything was fine. The four of them sat together, shared stories, passed plates. There was laughter, wine, and comfort. Everything felt normal, Until it didn't. Emily leaned over to reach for something, brushing against Matt's arm. Just a moment, just skin to skin. But it lingered. It lit something he hadn't been ready for. Not lust. Not even affection. Just awareness. A spark. And when he looked up, she was already looking at him. Across the table, Jake caught it. Barely. A glance. A breath too long. Something small but loud enough to register. He didn't say anything. Didn't react. But it sat in his gut like a stone. That night, back at their place, he and Emily stood side by side brushing their teeth. He asked, careful and casual, if she and Matt had been talking a lot that evening. She shrugged, rinsed, said he was just easy to talk to. That was all. Jake nodded. But inside something was twisting. It wasn't fear that she'd cheat. It was the quiet, terrifying realization that she might be feeling what he'd been feeling for Claire. Across the city, in their apartment, Claire stood at the sink staring out into the dark. Matt was behind her, scrolling through his phone, distracted. She spoke without turning around, mentioning something about him and Emily, seeming close lately. He didn't answer right away. Then came the usual deflection. Nothing to it, just friendly, don't read into things. Claire turned around slowly. Her voice was calm when she said she wasn't reading into anything, but maybe he should. Then she walked out of the room and left the silence to settle where the truth had been. The next day, it all reached a quiet boil. Jake showed up at Matt's place unannounced. The sun was high and the heat thick, and they sat out on the balcony with cold beers and a silence neither of them knew how to break. For a while, they just drank, letting the hum of traffic fill the space between them, but eventually, it broke. Matt spoke first, almost like he couldn't help it anymore. He said he was done pretending, done acting like everything was fine when it wasn't. The words came slow, heavy. He admitted what had been building inside him. That he liked Emily, that it wasn't just a crush, or a phase, or a fantasy. It was real enough to scare him. Jake didn't flinch, he listened. And when he finally spoke, he didn't deny anything. He simply said he'd been thinking the same thing about Claire. There was no yelling, no accusations. Just two old friends sitting in the middle of something neither of them had planned for. Not enemies. Not rivals. Just two people staring down the consequences of quiet desires and too many unsaid things. They didn't talk about breakups. Not yet. That wasn't even the question. The question was, what now? And as they sat there, letting the heat wrap around them, they both knew something had changed. Something permanent. Something that couldn't be walked back. The next time they saw each other, things would never be the same. There's always that one day when everything comes to a head. You don't know it when you wake up. You brush your teeth, check your phone, drink your coffee like any other morning. But by the time the sun sets, everything's different. For Jake, it started with a text from Claire. Just 4 words. Can we talk? Just us. They met at a park. Somewhere neutral, open, untangled from everything that had led them here. She was already on the bench when he arrived, back straight, expression unreadable. Claire had always carried herself like that, collected, composed. But today, there was something quieter behind her calm. Not anger, not regret, just clarity. She didn't waste time. She told him she knew. Knew about the way things had shifted. About the silence stretching between her and Matt. About the way Jake had started drifting toward it all without ever saying a word. She didn't need details. She didn't need proof. Some truths don't arrive with evidence. They arrive with absence, of touch, of intention, of loyalty. Jake didn't deny it. He said he hadn't acted on anything. She believed him. That wasn't the point. Because sometimes, it's not what you do that breaks things. It's what you think about doing. And once those thoughts take root, everything else starts to rot. Across the city, in the stillness of their apartment, Emily sat across from Matt at the kitchen table. 2 mugs of untouched coffee sat between them. The kind of coffee that gets cold before anyone dares to speak. She went first. Told him she knew too. Not just because Jake had said something, though he had, but because she could see it. The glances. The pauses. The way Matt looked at her when he didn't think she was watching. She hadn't wanted to believe it. But eventually, truth stops knocking and kicks the door in. Matt didn't argue. He couldn't. He confessed quietly, said it wasn't intentional, said it wasn't supposed to happen. But somehow, it had. Emily didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just sat with it, let it settle. And then, with a voice steadier than she felt, she said she deserved someone who didn't have to think twice about choosing her. And so did Claire. That evening, all four of them ended up back where it started. Same space, same people, but a completely different story. Matt's living room, 4 chairs, the air heavier than it had ever been. They weren't there to fight. They weren't there to fix anything. They were just there to let it all fall apart the right way. Jake spoke first, not out of leadership, just inevitability. He said what everyone was already thinking, that this wasn't working, that whatever it had been, love, comfort, nostalgia, wasn't enough anymore. No one pushed back. Matt looked at Claire, told her she deserved better, that he'd failed her in ways that weren't loud, but were real. She nodded, not to agree or to forgive, but to acknowledge the truth. Claire said they'd both made mistakes, that staying honest now was the only thing left they could do right. Emily, quiet until then, finally spoke. She said what no one else had found the words for, that they'd all been clinging to something that had already slipped away, and that was it. No yelling, no dramatic exits. No one begged or bargained. They didn't hug goodbye, didn't swear they'd stay close. They just stood, one by one, and left. 4 separate exits from the same unraveling. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, the silence that followed didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like relief. A few weeks later, Jake and Matt ran into each other again. No planning, no buildup, just a shared moment on a street corner neither of them expected. They didn't talk about the girls. They didn't talk about what they'd lost, or what they'd almost taken. They just sat on a bench, cracked a couple beers, and let the quiet settle in between them. Whether the friendship would survive, they didn't know. Some bonds bend. Others break. Time has a way of deciding for you. But one thing was certain. They'd both learned that chasing what looks better doesn't always mean you'll end up with something more. Sometimes it's just a different flavor of the same emptiness. A prettier box with the same missing piece. And 95% of people, they don't realize they're in that story